Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is something you were never supposed to hear. Not now, not ever. It is the kind of knowledge that once enters your bloodstream, it stains you forever. In the year 1872, hidden behind the velvet curtains of power and the perfumed halls of Europe's elite, a secret pregnancy was whispered about. A pregnancy that defied nature itself. A child conceived not in love, not even in desire, but in the cold mathematics of bloodlines. And what came from that womb was said to be the most inbred baby the world has ever seen. Stop for a moment. Imagine a world where family trees didn't spread outward, but instead folded inward like a serpent swallowing its tail. Kings marrying nieces, uncles taking brides who shared their very veins, cousins forced together to preserve a dynasty's throne. Generation after generation, the blood became thicker, darker, more poisonous. It wasn't marriage. It was a kind of alchemy, a dangerous experiment in human breeding, designed not for beauty or health, but for control. This is not a fairy tale of castles and crowns. It is a nightmare of hidden rooms, sterile whispers, and children born carrying the weight of centuries of corruption. You've been told history is a story of progress, but in truth, it is the story of families who bent the laws of flesh and spirit to their will until even nature rebelled. The year 1872 marks one of those rebellions, one of those unspeakable births. A baby brought into the world whose veins carried the sins of too many generations. The child was not just inbred. It was an echo of everything humanity fears: weakness disguised as strength, sickness disguised as purity, corruption disguised as destiny. Do you see it now? The world is not ruled by merit, not by greatness. It is ruled by the persistence of bloodlines. Bloodlines so determined to preserve power that they would destroy their own children to keep it. Think about what that means. The very men who sat on golden thrones, who decided wars and drew the borders of nations, were themselves sick, diseased, haunted by deformities, madness, and frailty, because the blood they worshipped was not a blessing. It was a curse, and yet they kept going. They could not stop. This is the truth, hidden beneath the pageantry. Every portrait of a king with his jeweled crown is a mask. Every royal lineage chart taught in schools is a lie by omission. Behind it all are the screams of women forced to birth children doomed before their first breath. And in 1872, the mask slipped. That birth, hushed, whispered, almost erased from the record, became a symbol, a warning, a sign that humanity itself cannot endure too much corruption, too much incestuous pride, because eventually the flesh collapses under the weight of arrogance. Ask yourself, why do you think history books rarely dwell on this? Why are these stories tucked away in the margins, treated like gossip, when in reality they shaped the destiny of nations? You were never meant to know. They do not want you to see the weakness at the heart of power. They do not want you to question the sacred bloodlines that still, even today, weave their influence into politics, finance, and control. You've been trained to bow before titles, to admire royalty, aristocracy, dynasties, but the truth is darker. Those titles were bought with blood that curdled long ago, and when you bow to them, you are bowing to sickness itself. 1872 was not just the story of one baby, it was the story of a system, a machine of control perfected through centuries of incest and secrecy. And tonight, I'm going to show you just how deep that machine goes. But be warned, once you see the truth, you cannot go back. You cannot unhear what I'm about to tell you. You've heard of royal scandals, you've seen the portraits of pale kings and queens gazing out from gilded frames, but the truth behind those painted eyes is not romance, not nobility. It is a cycle of controlled corruption, because power has never been about ideas. It has always been about blood. For centuries, Europe's monarchies and aristocracies perfected a system of breeding that would make any modern man recoil. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took their nieces as brides. Aunts were paired with nephews. Generations folded inward, collapsing like dying stars. To the outside world, they called it dynastic preservation. But beneath that elegant phrase was something closer to rot. Why did they do it? Because they believed blood carried divine right. They believed their blood was chosen by God himself. And so to mix with commoners would be to pollute heaven's will. Better to poison their own veins than to allow a new family to seize the throne. But nature is not fooled. Blood is not a toy, and generation after generation the price was paid in flesh. Look at the infamous Habsburg jaw, grotesque protrusions so severe that some rulers could barely chew their food. Look at the weak bones, the epilepsy, the madness whispered in castle corridors. Look at Charles II of Spain, a man so crippled by incest that he could barely walk, barely think, barely rule, yet was worshipped as the most powerful man in his empire. By the time 1872 arrived, the experiment was already a disaster, and yet it continued. Because here's the truth you were never taught. The elites do not stop, even when the cost is unbearable. They are willing to sacrifice children, women, whole generations for the illusion of control. The child born that year in 1872 was not the first inbred baby, but it was one of the most shocking. A grotesque fusion of centuries of incest, whispered about behind closed doors, spoken of only in rumor. The records are fragmented, deliberately erased, but the whispers remain, the deformity so severe that even doctors recoiled. The lifespan measured in hours, not years, a baby whose very existence mocked the idea of noble blood. And here lies the darkness. Even in death, the child was used as a warning to certain families, used as proof of the risk of impurity, not impurity of mixing blood, but impurity of letting the wrong bloodline ascend. Do you understand the twist? To them, the baby wasn't a tragedy. It was a political tool, another pawn in a game older than nations themselves. The aristocrats who orchestrated these unions didn't see children as human beings. They saw them as vessels, containers for the continuation of power. When the vessel shattered, they simply made another. When a baby died, they did not grieve. They calculated, they adjusted, and they tried again. This is where the corruption becomes unbearable, because the further you look, the more you see that the entire system of monarchy, aristocracy, and hidden dynasties was never about protection. It was never about nobility. It was about domination, wrapped in ritual. A machine that treated bloodlines as weapons, as chains, as spells. You, the ordinary man, were never part of this. You were the soil, you were the worker. Your purpose was to feed the system, never to touch it. And if you dared to see behind the curtain, if you dared to understand the sickness at the heart of these so-called divine rulers, you would be silenced. Just as many historians, whistleblowers, and dissidents have been silenced across centuries. But here's the secret. The sickness of inbred rulers was not just physical. It was psychological. It created kings who were paranoid, unstable, violent, cruel. Kings who waged wars out of insecurity, who destroyed nations because of whispers in their heads. It created queens who saw plots in every shadow, who lashed out in bloodlust to silence imagined enemies. It created leaders who believed themselves gods while being barely human. And still, you are taught to admire them. Still, their names are etched in history books. Still, the myth of royal greatness persists. But if you look closer, the story changes. These were not gods among men. They were broken humans, crumbling under the weight of corrupted blood. So when you hear of the shocking pregnancy of 1872, know this. It was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable result of centuries of arrogance. It was the natural conclusion of a system that placed blood above humanity, control above life. That baby was not an accident. It was a prophecy carved in flesh. A prophecy that power maintained through corruption always collapses into ruin. And yet, ask yourself, has it really stopped? Do you truly believe that these dynasties, these bloodlines, simply vanished? Or do you suspect, deep down, that they still exist, in shadows, hidden behind corporations, banks, governments? The same obsession with bloodlines, the same inbreeding of power, still happening in new forms? There is something you need to understand, something most men never dare to confront. The story of 1872 isn't just about a child. It is about a mirror that reflects the truth of what happens when power becomes obsessed with itself, when it turns inward, feeding on its own blood until there is nothing left but deformity. Think about the psychology of inbreeding for power. Imagine being born into a dynasty where you are told, from the moment you can speak, that your blood is sacred, that you are chosen, that you are superior to the men who plow the fields, to the soldiers who die on your command, to the servants who bow when you enter the room. But at the same time, imagine knowing, deep down, that your body is failing, that your mind is fragile, that your very existence is a mockery of strength. This contradiction breeds monsters. It breeds paranoia. It breeds rulers who lash out, desperate to prove a strength they do not possess. And that is why history is drenched in blood spilled by weak men in crowns. Now, listen carefully. The pregnancy of 1872 was not merely whispered about in back rooms of palaces. It was studied. It was dissected. Because the elites of that age were not just aristocrats, they were proto-scientists of control. They wanted to know, how far could blood be pushed before it collapsed? How much corruption could a family line endure before the body itself rebelled? And here's the chilling part. They were not horrified. They were curious. The suffering of women, the deaths of children, the grotesque births, these were seen as data points. Experiments in a grand design. Do you see the pattern? For you and me, life is sacred, but for them, life is currency, flesh is clay, children are vessels, and when a vessel breaks, they do not mourn. They move the pieces aside and continue the experiment. This is why history repeats itself, because the men who ruled then and the men who rule now do not feel the way you feel. They do not look at suffering as tragedy. They see it as necessary cost. They see it as opportunity. They see it as a weapon. And so, the baby of 1872 became a symbol, both a warning and a signal. To the families involved, it was proof of the limits of their methods. To their rivals, it was a chance to whisper, to undermine, to plot. The child's short existence, barely measured in days, still carried political weight. Because even deformity, even death can be bent into a tool when power is at stake. Pause for a moment. Imagine the room where the child was born, the curtains drawn tight, the midwives silent, sworn to secrecy, the father pacing not with love or fear, but with calculation. The mother broken, used, discarded, her body nothing more than a laboratory, the doctors leaning in with clinical detachment, noting every irregularity, every grotesque feature, every sign of collapse. Imagine the silence that followed the final breath, not broken by mourning but by whispers. What does this mean for the dynasty? What does this mean for the bloodline? This is how power thinks. This is the world you were never supposed to see, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now here's the deeper horror. This obsession with breeding, with inbreeding, with controlling human lineage, did not stay in the palaces of Europe. It spread, it evolved, it moved into laboratories, into universities, into secret societies. By the end of the 19th century, whispers of eugenics began. Scientists, funded by the wealthy, began to wonder, if breeding can destroy, can it also perfect? If blood can be weakened, can it also be engineered? Do you understand? The birth of 1872 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catalyst. It lit the spark of ideas that would, decades later, justify sterilizations, experiments, even genocides. The child's body became an unspoken textbook, a silent lesson for those hungry for control. This is the forbidden thread of history. You are told about wars, about politics, about kings and queens, but what you are not told is that beneath it all runs a darker current, the manipulation of blood itself. From incestuous dynasties to eugenics programs, from secret marriages to hidden laboratories, it is always the same obsession, controlling the flesh to control the future. And here is where you must be careful, because once you recognize this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. In the way elites marry among themselves, even now. In the way corporations fund genetic research. In the way governments talk about population control with cold detachment. It is the same mentality, dressed in new clothes. The 1872 pregnancy was not an ending. It was a doorway. And if you walk through that doorway with me, you will see the truth. That history has been one long experiment in domination. That the rulers of this world see you not as a man, but as material. And that the only way to resist is to awaken, to see what they have hidden in plain sight. Listen, this next layer is not pretty. It is where the blood-soaked dynasties stop being only a grotesque curiosity and begin to read like an instruction manual for control. If the pregnancy of 1872 taught the world anything, it was this. When you can shape bodies, you can shape minds. When you can choose who lives and who is removed from the gene pool, you can choose the kind of people who will do your bidding. That is where incestuous arrogance meets cold, clinical design, and where power becomes a psychological weapon. Power's first lesson is always to reframe suffering as data. The rulers who bred in secret measured every deformity, every cognitive lapse, every brittle bone as a variable. They catalogued the failures and rationalized them. When science arrived a century later and gave them a language, eugenics, heredity, genetic purity, they seized it like a scalpel. Suddenly, the ugly experiments in castle nurseries had a veneer of legitimacy. If the body could be corrected, the mind could be pointed. If the elite could improve a lineage, they could engineer obedience into its next generation. So how does that translate into control? The mechanics are uglier than you think. It begins with normalization. When a ruling class insists, day after day, portrait after portrait, that their blood is sacred, people absorb the message. Rituals, schooling, religion, every institution becomes a vector for the same whisper. This is right. This is ordained. Children in the presence of those symbols learn to internalize inferiority without anyone teaching them outright. That internalization is the true power of breeding, not the genes themselves, but the psychological structure that surrounds them. Then come the rituals of secrecy. The pregnancy in 1872 occurred behind closed doors because secrecy is a governance technology. Secrets protect power in two ways. They hide vulnerability and they create dependency. Those sworn to silence become linked. Their survival depends on the illusion remaining intact. When you're born into a system that prizes secrecy, you learn to navigate shadow as a survival skill. You trade truth for position. You become adept at lying to yourself. The child's deformity was not only a medical condition, it was a fracture in the theater of authority. Each fracture demands new layers of concealment. Each concealment hardens the psychology of the insiders. But the more secrets they pile on top of one another, the more brittle the system becomes. Anxiety metastasizes into paranoia. Paranoia becomes policy. Kings and barons who feared exposure moved from simple concealment to active control. Surveillance of servants, purges of perceived dissenters, orchestrated marriages to funnel wealth and silence into trusted lines. Their psychology flipped from preservation to predation. They stopped governing for prosperity. They began governing to prevent discovery. That is why many of the cruelties in history are not simply the actions of evil men. They are the desperate policies of fragile systems terrified of collapse. Beyond secrecy, a second tool emerges. Normalization through prestige. Every statue, every medal, every scientific paper that praised hereditary purity fed a cultural drumroll. The masses were trained to admire lineage and associate it with competence. Education systems taught civics and virtue while glossing over the rot at the root. Churches preached divine order and reduced messy human suffering to fate. By the time eugenics found its foothold, it had entire institutions willing to translate prejudice into practice. Sterilization laws, immigration restrictions, and pseudo-scientific classifications all flowed from the same river that birthed that doomed child in 1872. That river, call it the obsession with purity, has always carved new channels. There is another vector, emotional engineering. The elite learned to manipulate loyalties like strings on a puppet. They stoked shame among the populace. Shame about poverty, shame about mixed blood, shame about aspiration without the right pedigree. Shame is a remarkable controller because it immobilizes without force. It makes people police themselves and police others. If your identity is built on fear of losing status or being labeled impure, you will adopt the norms of those who claim power, even against your own interests. This is how social hierarchies perpetuate, not only by force, but through an architecture of emotion and belief. Now bend that lens toward institutions, schools, legal systems, religious organizations, and even scientific bodies. Each absorb the language and logic of inherited superiority, sometimes willfully, sometimes through subtle capture. Scholarships, fellowships, and clubs became modern salons of influence, gateways where bloodlines and health packaged themselves as merit. The same families who once married within closed circles now buy their way into educational and corporate dynasties. The faces changed, but the mechanism consolidation of influence remains the same. The child of 1872 may have vanished from public record, but the networks that benefited from preserving good bloodlines did not vanish. They learned to mutate, and then we arrive at the real danger, the transformation of this private pathology into public policy. The techniques that began in whisper, secrecy, normalization, shame, institutional capture are scalable. They can take entire populations and bend them toward a project. That project, in its modern guise, is less about royalty and more about systems. Who gets to decide who breeds, who moves, who votes, who learns? Today's elites do not need crowns. They have corporations, laboratories, media platforms, and legal frameworks. They have the power to redefine what counts as worth in human terms. Those definitions are rarely neutral. So what can a man like you do in the face of this machinery? First, see it. Awareness is the first strike against psychological control. When you recognize the rituals, when you name the mechanisms, you break their spell. The elites rely on your disbelief. They count on your respect for the pageantry to shield their rot. You must stop mystifying them. Call the systems what they are, networks of preservation, not of public service. Second, reclaim your narrative. These systems seek to own identity through shame and classification. Refuse the categories that reduce you to value tags. Third, build parallel rituals, small, honest rituals that anchor you to truth rather than spectacle. They will try to replace your meaning with their mythology. Give yourself meaning that cannot be bought. Before this descent becomes too clinical, remember one human fact. The people who engineered these systems were terrified men in fragile bodies. The child of 1872, in its own tiny, tragic way, was a mirror held up to them. And mirrors, when held, to those in power, can be deadly. That is why they broke the mirror and hid the shards. That is why they rewrote stories, buried archives, and created new myths that flatter their image. We are not here to smash every statue or burn every book. We are here to learn the grammar of their manipulation so we may speak a different language. Today their language means breeding, bloodlines, and secrecy. Tomorrow it might mean data, algorithms, and influence markets. The vocabulary will change, but the syntax, the way control is assembled, will remain familiar. Hold this. The descent into the history of 1872 is also a descent into the anatomy of power. Where you see a child used as a polities lesson, you also see the blueprint for psychological domination. The baby's tragedy is not isolated, it is structural. It is the quietly brutal invocation of the idea that some lives are instruments and some people are tools. If you accept that premise, you accede to that world. Now we step into the laboratories where secrecy long ago found a new language, science. The grotesque birth of 1872 was not only a moral fracture, it became a data set that hungry men turned into doctrine. The same families that once bent bodies to preserve thrones handed their ledgers, their obsessions, and their money to men with microscopes and diplomas. What had been whispered in castle corridors was translated into charts, into grant proposals, into blueprints for social engineering. This is where private pathology learned to wear the uniform of expertise. Think of the laboratories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They smell of antiseptic and ambition. They hum with the low confidence of men who have found a method to reduce human life to variables. These places did not invent the idea of controlling blood. They professionalized it. They taught polite institutions how to speak the language of selection and improvement without shame. And the language was seductive because it promised order, efficiency, and an answer to the chaos of human difference. Who could argue with a method that claims to make society stronger, healthier, purer, especially when wrapped in charts and endorsements from people in white coats? But the white coats were not neutral. They were funded by families and institutions that wanted outcomes aligned with preservation. Wealthy patrons poured money into eugenic societies, into journals, into academic chairs. The grotesque experiments of aristocratic nurseries were sanitized into research. Those who questioned the ethics were dismissed as sentimental, backward, or unscientific. The public learned to trust expertise while missing the strings attached to its purse. The result? The private aims of dynasties and the public authority of science fused into a new machine of control. This machine refined its tools. It moved from arranged marriages to sterilization laws, from secret alliances to public policy. It created categories, fit and unfit, normal and degenerate, that could be used to exclude entire classes of people. It taught bureaucracies to think in the language of metrics. If you could quantify a human's worth, you could justify removing them from the equation. If you could label a group as genetically insufficient, you could find reasons to limit their reproduction, their rights, their place in the nation. This is the dangerous cunning of expertise. It dresses prejudice as progress. And so the tragedy of 1872, once a hidden horror, became an undercurrent feeding these policies. The child's deformity, the failed experiment of blood perfected into a grotesque form, was rationalized as evidence that certain lines should be closed, certain veins cleansed. That logic metastasized. It found new homes in public health campaigns, in immigration restrictions, and in the construction of social hierarchies that masqueraded as national interests. Experts with clipboards could write laws, and those laws could do violence under the guise of science. Here's the next step in their playbook: standardization. Institutions love scale. Scale consolidates control. So the ideas that began in the hush of aristocratic rooms needed mechanisms to spread. Education, certification, state-sanctioned programs. Textbooks began to contain subtle assumptions about heredity. Medical exams assessed more than health. They assessed normalcy against manufactured standards. Welfare systems were redesigned to punish what they called undesirability. The architecture of modern bureaucracy made these interventions efficient, repeatable, and bureaucratically invisible. You didn't need a proclamation from a king when a form, a checkbox, and an agency could accomplish the same exclusion. This was the point where psychological control became systemic. When men in suits and white coats could claim objectivity, they weaponized trust. Entire communities internalized the narrative that certain traits were undesirable and that their removal was necessary for the public good. People began to police themselves and their neighbors. Mothers feared telling doctors about family histories. Children learned shame about origins. When a society's institutions endorse hidden hierarchies, the shame seeps into daily life and then into the self. The most efficient form of control is the one people administer to themselves. Now, pause and look at how the template evolved. The old elites prized purity of blood. The modern elites prize purity of systems, data, pedigree, capital. The mechanism is identical: identify, declassify, exclude. Instead of arranged marriages, we have networks that filter access to education, to capital, to influence. Instead of secretive nurseries, we have private labs and venture funds shaping who gets to thrive. It's the same DNA of domination, made contemporary. If you are feeling the charge of this moment, if you feel a need to step into this revelation, you must act in a way they understand. Reflection alone is not enough. Speak to anchor yourself in the truth. Type the phrase that binds recognition into identity. I see the truth. Type it again, twice, and mean it. I see the truth. I see the truth. Do this now in the comments. Not for me, not for the algorithm, for yourself. For the moment when recognition needs to be named out loud. Write it twice as a ritual. A public claim that you refuse to be passive, a private oath that you will not carry shame unexamined. This small act of repetition is how movements begin, by men who name themselves and their new seeing. Do it. Say it. Lock it in. Because once you name the truth, everything looks different. The edifices of authority begin to show their seams. The experts do not magically lose power, but their narrative no longer has the monopoly of legitimacy over your mind. You begin to notice the patterns where the privileged align with neutral institutions to preserve advantage. You begin to see how policies that appear benign, health campaigns, immigration rules, zoning laws, carry hidden currents that protect privilege and punish freedom. Do not underestimate the emotional cost of this vision. It is heavy. It will bring sorrow for those who were hurt, outrage at those who weaponize science, and a cold clarity about how systems can be turned against humanity. But sorrow sharpens judgment. Outrage steels resolve. Use both. Transform the pain of discovery into a disciplined force that refuses to accept authority unchallenged. Remember the child of 1872 as a warning, not merely as a lament. Remember how private obsession found public language. Remember how expertise, when captured, can sanctify cruelty. Most importantly, remember that where they once used blood to justify dominance, they now use systems and narratives. The names change, the methods evolve, the hunger for control endures. We leave the labs and step now into the engine rooms of modern power, media houses, banks, think tanks, and those administrative monoliths stitched together with contracts and confidences. If the pregnancy of 1872 was the old world's symptom, then the 20th and 21st centuries are its treatment plan. More subtle, more efficient, less obvious, but infinitely more dangerous because it can be invisible. The elites learn to translate lineage into leverage and leverage into systems. Where once they married cousins to keep property in the family, now they merge balance sheets, buy outlets, and place men behind boards to manufacture consent and preserve advantage. Listen, institutions don't have mercy, they have incentives, and incentives are what convert private pathology into public practice. Money flows where advantage consolidates, influence gravitates toward those who can bend narratives. The same dynastic obsession that created that grotesque child in 1872 now uses capital to ensure no inconvenient truths leak into daylight. The narrative of superiority is bought, seeded, and amplified. The portraits have gone digital. The crowns are now logos and tickers. Consider the media machine. A century ago, gossip circulated in salons. Today, it is packaged into channels, platforms, and trend cycles. Stories that threaten entrenched interests are softened, buried, or reframed. Meanwhile, narratives that sanctify extraction, meritocracy myths, the sanctity of elite networks, the morality of efficient policies are amplified until they become common sense. This is not accident. It's design. Editorial lines are not just editorial, they are policy instruments. PR firms, think tanks, and donor-funded institutes form an ecology that filters reality through lenses sympathetic to those who pay. The more you control the story, the more you control how people feel about their place in the world. Next, finance. Money is both lubricant and lock. When capital flows into universities, foundations, and research centers, it brings with it the quiet hand of prioritization. Grants steer what is studied, what is normalized, what is deemed worthy. Investments favor systems that reproduce advantage. Proprietary algorithms, gated platforms, credentialed institutions. Wealthy families and their corporate successors pay for infrastructure that ensures their influence is exponential rather than hereditary in a biological sense. The result? Access becomes a modern bloodline. Financial pedigree replaces royal pedigree. The child of 1872 would not be safer if she had the right bank account. She would be erased from memory if the right accounts were closed. Then there are the administrative arteries, the legal codes, regulatory agencies, and bureaucracies that make policy feel like inevitability. Laws framed in neutral language, safety, efficiency, national interest, hide moral choices. They embed advantage into the architecture of everyday life. Zoning rules segregate communities. Tax codes favor capital accumulation. Licensing regimes gate access to professions. These are not random. They are the modern cousin marriages, legal structures that keep influence circulating within a favored circle while making mobility for outsiders slow, costly, and risky. But perhaps the most startling transformation is technological: surveillance, data, and algorithms. Where secrecy once required whispered oaths in castle halls, secrecy now uses encryption, private servers, shadow companies, and targeted content. The same appetite for control that once manipulated marriages now manipulates attention. Data is the new blood. It reveals fears, patterns, social ties. With enough data and enough predictive models, influence becomes anticipatory. They don't just respond to dissent, they foresee it, preempt it, and neutralize it with precise, scalable interventions. An idea that might have spread through a coffeehouse pamphlet is now throttled at the source by an algorithm. A network that might have rallied in a town square is diffused with a targeted campaign that redirects anger toward a comfortable scapegoat. This is the modern art of governance, managing behavior at scale while calling it personalization. All of this, media, finance, bureaucracy, and tech, are not isolated tools. They are a coordinated ecosystem. They feed each other. A think tank publishes a paper that legitimizes a law. A law creates market incentives that attract investment. Investment funds, the platforms that narrate those incentives as innovation. The architecture is designed so that any single scandal looks like an anomaly while the structural design remains untouched. You see a headline about an individual failing and mistake it for systemic truth about people rather than a symptom of engineered conditions, and yet the pattern is recognizable because it is the same grammar of preservation. The elites learned to convert biological rituals into institutional ones. Where a marriage once sealed a pact, a merger now seals influence. Where a sealed room once hid deformity, databases now hide patterns people would rather not see. The child of 1872 may have been erased from page 1, but the networks that preserved the illusion of purity only grew smarter. They built layers, legal, cultural, technological, so their vulnerabilities would be difficult to expose and even harder to dismantle. Now listen carefully. This is not fatalism. Recognition is not resignation. You are not powerless because the machinery is sophisticated. You are dangerous because you can see it. Men who awaken to structure and motive can act in ways the system does not anticipate. The first step is diagnosis. Map the nodes of influence. Who funds the narrative? Who benefits from a given policy? Which platforms amplify what messages? The second step is alignment. Form networks among those who refuse to be edged out. Create parallel institutions that reward competence and integrity instead of pedigree. The third step is disruption. Small, surgical acts that make the system recalibrate. Boycotts that move capital, whistleblowing that forces transparency, local institutions that create alternatives to capture. Remember, the elites fear two things: exposure and unpredictability. The child of 1872 exposed a truth they wanted hidden. The dynasty responded with secrecy and explanation. Today, you can weaponize transparency and unpredictability. Flooding light on a network's finances, revealing ties between donors and policy, or creating resilient local economies can unbalance the maksui. Hein. It is not about dismantling every structure overnight, it's about making influence costly for those who rely on hidden advantage. Now we enter dangerous territory, the place where these blood-soaked blueprints stop being abstract systems and start becoming personal. Because the dynastic obsession that once deformed a baby in 1872 and later mutated into laboratories, think tanks, and bureaucracies has reached into you, into your mind, your masculinity, your sense of self. The experiment did not stop with crowns or laws or grants. It moved into culture, shaping what a man believes about himself, his worth, his future. Do you understand what that means? It means the control system no longer needs chains or royal decrees. It works because men chain themselves. They measure their value by the very metrics the system handed them: income, prestige, titles, pedigree. Just like those old aristocrats measured themselves by blood, the pattern repeats. Different costumes, same script. Think of how you were raised. From a young age, you were shown examples of what success looks like. Men in suits on screens, athletes worshipped for entertainment, politicians crowned as leaders. You were told, this is power, this is what makes you a man. Yet behind every image, behind every example, is a hidden network deciding which stories get told, which role models get elevated, which definitions of masculinity are rewarded. The machine does not leave these things to chance. If men define themselves wrongly, they will never rise beyond being tools. Here's the cruelty. The same pathology that once produced fragile monarchs now produces fragile men in the masses. Men who are insecure, easily provoked, desperately searching for validation. Men who self-destruct because they measure themselves against illusions carefully curated by the same forces that profit from their collapse. Remember, paranoia destroyed kings. Now it destroys workers, husbands, fathers who never realized the paranoia was planted in them. Look at the architecture of shame. In dynasties, shame policed women, forcing them into marriages, silencing them when children were deformed. Today, shame polices men. Not strong enough? Shame. Not wealthy enough? Shame. Not educated in the right institutions? Shame. The very emotion that kept elites compliant in secrecy is now turned outward to keep you compliant in systems. You absorb the shame, you fear being seen as unworthy, and you exhaust yourself chasing validation in arenas you never chose. And here's the twist. They do not want you to master yourself. True self-mastery is dangerous. A man who knows his own worth, independent of their metrics, is untouchable. He cannot be baited with cheap validation. He cannot be controlled with fear of shame. He cannot be herded into systems that chew him up. That man is a sovereign, and sovereignty is the one thing the elites cannot tolerate outside their circles. This is why the history of 1872 matters. That baby was not just a tragedy. It was a symbol of what happens when you let others define your worth. The elites defined worth by blood, and they destroyed themselves. Today, men let institutions define worth by money, status, and external symbols. And again, men are being destroyed. Different poison, same collapse. Now stop and look around you. Notice how every major platform, every algorithm, every ad campaign is designed to exploit your insecurity. They whisper, "You are not enough. Buy this, chase this, become this." Just as the dynasties whispered, "You are not enough unless you preserve your blood." These whispers are not accidents. They are psychological chains. You are trained to believe them so that you remain predictable, manageable, small. But you are listening to me now. You are seeing the pattern. And once you see it, the chains lose their weight. You realize you don't have to play their game. You don't have to measure yourself by their metrics. You don't have to carry their shame. You can build sovereignty from the inside out through discipline, awareness, and refusal. Ask yourself, what happens if a generation of men stop believing the lie? What happens if thousands, millions stand up and say, "I will not measure myself by your pedigree, your paycheck, your manufactured standards. I measure myself by my mastery, my will, my truth." That is when the machine trembles, because it cannot process men who reject its programming. This is why I speak to you like this, not as entertainment, not as history, but as initiation. You are being initiated into seeing what they never wanted you to see. That the true war is not only over bloodlines or institutions, but over your very definition of self. If they can define it, they own you. If you define it, you become free. Understand this deeply. Every time you chase their metrics, you descend into the same madness that produced the inbred monarchs. Every time you resist, you rise into sovereignty. It is that simple. The choice is yours. But the choice is not neutral. One path is collapse. The other is transformation. Now we descend to the great engine of consent. Propaganda, storytelling, branding, the mass-scale psychological machinery that turned private pathology into public obedience. If the pregnancy of 1872 was a secret carved into flesh, propaganda is the hammer that buries that secret under monuments of meaning. It is the technique by which a few fractures in power become a civilization's operating system. And make no mistake, this system is surgical, patient, and merciless. Propaganda is not crude shouting. It is architecture. It is the slow shaping of what a people feels before they can name it. It begins not with orders, but with stories, movies, songs, news cycles, bestsellers that fold a cultural preference into the natural order. Yesterday's myths of royal blood became today's myths of meritocracy and market wisdom. The story changes its clothes, but the beat remains. Teach people to accept an arrangement that benefits a few, and they will defend it as common sense. The art of propaganda has 3 moves. First, simplify reality into archetypes. Good versus bad, pure versus impure. Clean narratives flatten complexity so quickly that nuance dies before it can be considered. A reader scrolling a headline, a viewer watching a clip, a listener absorbing a podcast, these are all being trained to digest archetypes. Once archetypes take hold, actual facts are irrelevant. The human mind will interpret the world through those frames. The child born in 1872 becomes, in this translated language, a cautionary tale about otherness, about danger to the order, except the message is inverted so that the danger always points outward toward scapegoats, not inward toward the architects of power. Second, repeat. The most powerful propaganda is not a single grand speech. It is 1,000 whispers. Repetition makes the unfamiliar familiar, and familiarity breeds acceptance. Repeat an idea across platforms and mediums, news, film, academic journals, marketing, and it becomes a background rhythm of reality. This is why modern propaganda invests in ecosystems, media conglomerates, entertainment studios, curriculum councils. They are the echo chambers that take a narrative from seed to forest. The elites behind closed doors learned that they didn't need to compel every mind. They only needed to saturate the air until people began to hum the tune themselves. Third, personalize the narrative so people feel seen by the story while remaining invisible as agents of change. Propaganda offers cons. Olation, identity, belonging, simplified meaning. It says, you belong here. Your pain has a cause. Your place is known. That solace is powerful because it eases anxiety and converts resistance into loyalty. The same systems that once secured dynastic power by promising divine right now secure consent by offering curated identity, consumer identity, national identity, class identity, each a velvet rope that keeps men in place. People will often choose comfort over truth because comfort reduces the painful work of autonomy. These moves are not merely theoretical, they have concrete mechanisms. Look at the manufacturing of consent in policy debates. A think tank produces a white paper, crisp graphs, authoritative language, conveniently funded by the same interests that benefit from its recommendations. Journalists, trained to rely on sources who already appear authoritative, quote the paper. Educators integrate the findings. The repeat cycle begins. By the time citizens encounter the policy, it appears inevitable and technocratic. That inevitability is propaganda's greatest victory. It makes structural choices feel like neutral facts of life. Now consider attention economics, the modern corollary to palace gossip. Platforms monetize your gaze. They reward content that drives engagement, outrage, and tribal alignment. The algorithms do not care about truth. They reward intensity. Intensity is currency, and currency attracts attention-hungry actors. That creates feedback loops. Content that stokes fear and division spreads fastest. The result is a landscape where subtle framing is replaced by extremity, where the simplest, angriest stories win. This is the engine that converts private interests, those old dynasties' descendants, into corporate and institutional successes, into cultural producers. They no longer need to hide. They need to manipulate the metrics that decide who is heard. There is also the politics of scarcity and the politics of moral panic. Manufacture a scarcity of jobs, of status, of dignity, and people will clamor for managers who promise to protect them. Create moral panics about contamination, crime, the foreign other, and whole populations will eagerly accept draconian measures. These are the psychological levers that transform a fissure like the 1872 birth into a pretext for sweeping social engineering. Instead of confronting the reality that elites weaponize systems to preserve privilege, societies are distracted by invented threats that never address the root cause. Propaganda is most effective when it co-opts language of liberation and uses it to entrench hierarchy. Progress, safety, efficiency. These words become masks. They are stitched onto policies designed to consolidate advantage. A public told they are acting in the name of progress often participates in their own marginalization. This is the inversion that has always accompanied elite preservation. The rhetoric of collective good covers the mechanics of concentration. So what do you do as a man who sees this? First, refuse the trance of passive reception. Recognize how narratives are constructed, who benefits, who funds, who repeats. Demand sources, not simply consensus. Second, slow down your consumption. Repetition relies on saturation. The antidote is patience. Seek multiple perspectives, especially those outside the curated echo. Third, cultivate narrative independence. Tell different stories where you are, among friends, in your community, in your work. Small counter-narratives erode propaganda's monopoly. They teach us to question the archetypes rather than to swallow them. Finally, remember how intimacy factors in propaganda's power. It is not simply mass, it is micro. Personalized ads, targeted content, and community-specific narratives create the illusion that the story is chosen by you. That personalization is the web's most insidious gift to power. It makes manipulation feel like self-expression. Fight that by creating rituals of reflection, moments where you name the narrative you are feeling and ask who benefits from it. When you can name the hand that shapes a story, you break its spell. You've seen the systems, the laboratories of control, the machinery of propaganda, but now you must see the architects themselves, the faces behind the curtain, because dynasties did not disappear. They adapted. The incestuous monarchies that produced the child of 1872 may have shed their crowns, but their heirs still walk among us, cloaked in new symbols. board seats, foundations, trusts, and international councils. They learned from their mistakes. They learned that if you flaunt power too openly, the people sharpen guillotines. So they mastered invisibility. They traded scepters for signatures, thrones for boardrooms, bloodlines for brands. They moved into the shadows of philanthropy, into the language of progress and global governance. But the goal has never changed. Consolidate advantage, preserve lineage, and ensure the machinery of the world serves their interests before yours. Look carefully at the families that orbit our institutions of finance, energy, and media. Their names may not always headline news, but they whisper through history like a watermark. Their fortunes, built in the coal mines, oil fields, and railroads of the industrial age, did not dissolve with time. They hardened into foundations, vast reservoirs of capital that fund universities, research centers, NGOs. And with funding comes direction. With direction comes influence. With influence comes control. And control at that level does not feel like tyranny. It feels like inevitability. A medical curriculum shaped by one foundation funds doctors who trust certain pharmaceutical approaches while ignoring others. A journalism fellowship paid for by another foundation trains writers to adopt certain framings while dismissing others. The result is a generation of professionals who carry the dynasty's values without ever having met its members. That is true power, to write the software of a culture while remaining invisible in the code. The global clubs and councils are the modern feudal halls. Davos, Bilderberg, the private roundtables, these are not just conferences. They are rituals of coordination. They are where the narrative of inevitability is refreshed each year. The speeches about shared futures, the panels about equity or climate, all carefully woven with policy recommendations that, curiously, always circle back to centralization and elite stewardship. The same psychological trick is repeated. Portray control as benevolence, portray coordination as necessity, portray dissent as irresponsibility. Even more insidious are the interlocking boards. A man sits on the board of a bank, but also on the board of a university, and perhaps on the board of a tech firm. Influence compounds silently. When those institutions independently decide on a direction, funding a project, promoting a leader, endorsing a policy, the decisions appear plural, democratic. In reality, they are orchestrated by a web of shared hands. It is dynastic incest translated into organizational DNA. Different names, same genes. Now, let us be blunt. These networks are not omnipotent. They are not gods. They are men and women afraid of losing what they believe is their birthright. Fear drives them, the same fear that drove their royal ancestors to lock their daughters into cousin marriages. Fear of dilution, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing their place in history. That fear makes them ruthless. It makes them willing to silence, distort, and engineer realities to preserve advantage. But fear also makes them fragile. And fragility is an opportunity. The opportunity is this. Once you can map the web, you can anticipate the moves. Once you understand how dynasties preserve influence, not through overt domination, but through invisible coordination, you can begin to build alternatives. Not revolutions that burn overnight and collapse into ashes, but networks of resilience, independent economies, parallel narratives, sovereign communities. The same way they built trust funds and think tanks, you build brotherhoods and systems that cannot be quietly absorbed. You must also understand, the families that rule are not isolated. They are symbiotic with the bureaucracies they feed. Government agencies, multinational corporations, NGOs, they serve as the operational arms of dynastic strategy. The family name may not sign the executive order, but the network financed the study that justified it. The family may not own the corporation outright, but the board interlocks guarantee its alignment. If you imagine power as a pyramid, you misunderstand it. Power is a web, a nervous system pulsing with unseen connections. And that is why exposure is dangerous. Naming the names, tracing the ties, connecting the dots, that is heresy. That is why journalists who wander too close often find their careers evaporating. That is why academics who publish beyond the approved script lose funding. That is why whistleblowers are discredited before they are heard. The dynasty learned, kill the story, not the man, silence the voice before it echoes. But here you are, listening, seeing, connecting. And that sight is an act of rebellion. Because the most important truth is this: dynasties survive because men refuse to believe they exist. The people laugh off conspiracy, call it myth, dismiss it as paranoia, and in that dismissal, they gift the dynasty another century of cover. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you name, you cannot unknow. And once enough men awaken, the invisibility cloak tears. Listen, this is the last corridor, the end of the descent. Whatever you thought you were safe from, whatever polite ignorance clothed as comfort you relied on, you will leave behind here. This is the place where the private pathology of blood becomes the public art of domination, where the wound in a palace nursery blossoms into a system that can shape a man's heartbeat, his loyalties, his appetite for truth. If you step out of this room unchanged, you have not listened. If you leave unchanged, you never meant to resist. Everything you've heard so far converges now. The ritual marriages, the hidden births, the laboratories that sanctified cruelty, the institutions that normalized it, the media that buried the story under 1,000 repeats, the families that perfected invisibility. All of it points toward one terrifying capability: the capacity to program human perception at scale, not through overt force, but through grooming of attention, of appetite, of identity. The same hunger for purity that produced the most inbred baby now breeds methods that make men obedient without chains. Make no mistake, this is not an accident. It is deliberate engineering. The architects studied how men think, what makes them fearful, what makes them proud. They learned to seed desires they could monetize, to cultivate fears they could exploit, to articulate identities they could puncture and then sell back. The tools are subtle: a news cycle tailored to inflame, a curriculum that narrows origins into statistics, a platform that learns your triggers and feeds them back as bait. The machine is patient. It refines its hooks by watching which ones catch. You might ask, who are the victims? Everyone, but not equally. Men like you, awake, hungry for meaning, willing to bear the price of knowing, are both threat and hope. The system worries about you because a single awakened man can unspool its narratives in his circle. He can teach others to question, to trace funding, to refuse the hollow consolations. That is why the system softens you with comfort and hardens you with distraction. It wants to keep you predictable. So here is the final truth, merciless and clarifying. Power does not want your submission because it is cruel. It wants your identity because identity is leverage. When they can define who you are, they can align your choices with their ends. When you accept measures of worth they sell you, you begin to police yourself. When you believe their definitions of success, you defend their systems for the illusion of being allowed inside. That is the modern lineage of incestuous power, cultural inbreeding that reproduces advantage by shaping souls. But this is where you break the lineage, not with violence, not with naive optimism, with calibrated sovereignty, with ritualized disruption, with a life organized around autonomy rather than approval. Here is a practical, unforgiving program, a way to convert revelation into resistance. Keep it simple. Keep it brutal. First, reclaim attention. For 7 days, remove or radically limit the platforms that feed your reflexive outrage and envy. Replace them with reading, with disciplined study of history and strategy, with conversations that require extended thought. Attention is the currency they steal. Reclaim it, and you shrink their leverage. Second, audit your loyalties. Write down the voices you trust. Where are they funded? Whose money underwrites their institutions? Trace 2 degrees out. Donors, board members, institutional partners. You do not need to believe every name is evil. You need to know the architecture you're listening through. Knowledge dissolves mystique. Third, build parallel competence. Learn a craft, a trade, a discipline that connects you to real value outside credentialed gates. This is practical sovereignty. When your livelihood is not contingent on approval from credentialed networks, your freedom increases. Mastery is armor against moral manipulation. Fourth, ritualize truth-telling. Twice a week, speak plainly to a small circle, friends, family, a local group. Tell them what you see. Teach them the pattern recognition you've learned. Truth spreads in fragments. Your words are the needle that unravels the cloth of manufactured consent. Fifth, protect your institutions. If you are part of an organization, volunteer, union, community board, club, Bring transparency practices. Demand funding disclosures. Insist on diverse sources of support. Convert closed systems into accountable ones. The dynasty survives on opacity. You weaponize transparency. Sixth, become literate in scale. Learn how narratives are built. Funding flows, editorial cycles, algorithmic incentives. You don't need a PhD, you need curious patience. Read a white paper, map one foundation, follow one tech company's board. Practice until the pattern is as obvious as a repeating tile. Familiarity kills fear. Seventh, steward your inner economy. This is the invisible work: sleep, diet, focused labor, cold exposure, disciplined study. The elites bank on distraction and depletion. Restore your reserves. A man who sleeps, reads, and trains is hard to manipulate. Eighth, form resilient networks. Small, decentralized groups with shared practice and mutual accountability. No loud leaders, no celebrity. Shared resources, shared audits, local economies that trade value directly. They are slow to form and hard to co-opt. Finally, ritual commitment. Once a month, publicly state your measures of worth, in writing, in oath, to at least one witness. Repeat them. Refinement over time matters. This is the modern counterpart to the old rituals that bound dynasties together, except it binds you to truth instead of to secrecy. If you perform these actions, you do more than survive. You become contagious. One man who refuses to be defined by proprietary metrics breaks a node in the machine. 10 men do damage. 1,000 men create a parallel infrastructure that the dynasty cannot swallow without exposing itself. This is not an apocalyptic call to arms. It is a measured strategy to counter a century-long program of psychological enclosure. The child of 1872 died as a symptom. You are alive as an antidote. You are the corrective, if you choose to be. Before you step back into the world, hear this final command. Never accept language that reduces your worth to a single axis. Never bow to institutions that demand secrecy. Never outsource your courage to benevolence. The most dangerous men are not those who hoard secrets. They are those who sell you a comfortable identity in exchange for your silence. Go now with a clear edge. You have seen the machine. You know its seams. Your task is to be precise, relentless, and humane. Teach others without rage. Build without vanity. Expose without cruelty. The descent ends here, but the work begins. Remember the baby of 1872, not as a horror to gawk at, but as a mirror that shows the sickness of a system. Let that mirror sharpen your resolve. Let your life be the answer they could not engineer.